Great to see you all. We have a special surprise here. The Sankofa Academy of Brooklyn. The principal, Ollie McLean, is in the front row. And
come on, Pete.
I'm going to invite her students to take a few minutes to get us started in a very special way. Ollie, would you get us organized?
That's all right.
We were kidnapped from our homes in Africa and brought to the shores of Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, and more. Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa. Still 35 to go. Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, and good old Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska. Number 27, 28 is Nevada. There is New Hampshire and New Jersey. Way down there is New Mexico, New York, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania. Now let's see. Rhode Island, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont. We are almost through. Virginia, Washington, and West Virginia too. Wisconsin, and Wyoming. Now we're done. Hope you understand from Africa to the United States. We have all come.
Isn't that something? What a way to start off hearing like this.
In honor of our ancestors on whose shoulders we stand, we will now name the 54 nations of Africa from whence we came. Algeria, Angola, Benin, Botswana, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cameroon, Cape Verde, Central African Republic, Chad, Comoros, Congo, Brazzaville, Congo, Kinshasa, Cote d'Ivoire, Djibouti, Egypt, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Gabon, Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Kenya, Lesotho, Liberia, Libya, Madagascar, Malawi, Mali, Mauritania, Mauritius, Morocco, Mozambique, Namibia, Nigeria, Rwanda, Sao Tome and Principe, Senegal, Seychelles, Sierra Leone, Somalia, South Africa, South Sudan, Swaziland, Tanzania, Togo, Tunisia, Uganda, Western Sahara, Zambia, and Zimbabwe.
Wow. Thank you, young people. You made us very proud of you. Give them another hand. Now, when I convened this panel a year ago, we were focused on the Shelby County versus Holder decision from the court. which suspended implementation of Section 5 pre-clearance program under the Voting Rights Act by invalidating the formula that was used to designate covered jurisdiction. Last year, we discussed the ways in which the Shelby County decision would potentially undermine individuals' rights to vote. Today, a year later, many of the predictions made last year suggesting equal access to the voting booth would no longer be equal and have sadly come to fruition. Dressed in the guise of a voter fraud prevention, many formerly covered jurisdictions have changed their voting laws, which have had impact on limiting the right to vote, particularly among African Americans, Latinos, and even young people. In North Carolina, they passed a strict new photo ID requirements. In addition to eliminating the same-day voter registration, reducing the early voting period by 7 days, and also by throwing out ballots cast at the wrong polling stations. In Texas, they passed a voter ID law that one federal judge called, quote, the most stringent in the country, end quotation. It requires voters to present an approved form of photo ID when previously they were just able to present mail, utility bills, or other proof of voter registration. The Justice Department condemned the law based on the state's finding that Hispanic registered voters were far less likely to have the approved photo IDs. One of our panelists is fresh from the trial challenging this troubling provision. In Tennessee, a bill restricting the acceptable forms of ID that can be used was enacted by the state legislature. Previously, voters could use the forms of ID like library cards, student IDs, out-of-state ID. Now, only photo IDs issued by the state of Tennessee or the federal government are acceptable. These laws are not unique to these 3 states, but are becoming standard. Similar laws have been passed in other states, including Florida, Virginia, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Arizona, among others. And so as we move into the general election cycle, the 2016 primary season, it's clear that these efforts must be stopped or reduced as much as we can. In Congress, we clearly have our work cut out for us in order to pass legislation addressing issues like voter ID, early voting, and online registration. And so this panel is part of our efforts for educating Congress and the public about the efforts being made by states across the nation to suppress voter rights. We have a really distinguished group of panelists, and I was all prepared to introduce our moderator because I thought he wasn't going to be here on time, and sure enough, Michael Eric Dyson is on the case and is here, and we're so glad to welcome him at this point. Let's give him a round of applause.
It's a great honor to be here with the great Dean of the Congress, John Conyers. I mean, overall, not just the black contingent, but the American contingent of Congress people showing some love. It's all right to be a sprinter, but he's a long distance runner. He's been carrying that baton before many in this room were even born. So we ought to pay homage, we ought to pay honor, we ought to pay respect, we ought to pay acknowledgement to what this man has done. Let's stand on your feet and give John Conyers some love. real dapper as he can be. Just as sharp as he can be, an extraordinary man, so we're grateful to be here. Look, there's a lot of people up here to talk, and a lot of folk who can speak. So I'm not going to waste your time in any elaborate introductions. I will open by saying this. In the wake of Shelby County versus Holder, Eric Holder, black man, in the White House, black man, as Attorney General, black man who represented our interests. I don't know about you, but I shed some tears yesterday. Huh? Me and Eric Holder went to see Sade. It's a true story. We went to see Sade, we went downstairs, and we took a picture with Sade. Now, Sade said, I'm just telling you what she said. She said, I have scarcely met two more distinguished gentlemen in my life, save perhaps my father. I turned to Eric, I said, man, she talking about me, what's she saying about you? Then we took pictures with her, and when we compared pictures, it was me, Sade, and Eric Holder. He cut me out of his picture. I had cut him out of mine, and we knew we were genuine brothers. That's the kind of man he is. Go see Sade and attack the sadistic assault upon our interests as people of color. And I'll tell you this, unapologetically black man who understood the specificity of his heritage and his derivation genetically, but also spoke to the transcendent universal purposes of American democracy. Gotta give Eric Holder some love as well. In the wake of Shelby County versus Holder, we'll enter a new political season without Section 5. And one of the things we liked about him being there, Professor Spencer Overton, Detroit man representing, and others can speak to this, Sister Dianis, Attorney Dianis. We can talk about the fact that Eric Holder was quite creative in using other numbers. Black people do know how to play the numbers. Boxer put a dime on it. I know y'all know about that street lottery. Don't act like you don't know what I was talking about. I know Reverend Anthony's from Detroit. He has seen many numbers runners, probably taken tithes from them, so he understands. All money is from Jesus, all right? So Eric Holder was able to do different things with different provisions. But we're without Section 5 Voting Rights Act protection for the first time in 50 years. We know about the attack that Congressman Conyers talked about on the right to deprive people of color and others from their voting rights. This is not a conspiratorial, victimizing, victim-mongering discourse. This is just bottom line. When they saw us voting and turning out in big numbers, then they started getting reactionary and coming against us. Because the same ID that allowed me to vote, that allowed people to vote for George Bush wasn't good enough to vote for Barack Obama.
Yes.
Wow. Man, I'm just saying, that was the Reverend Dr. Freddie Haynes saying, wow, he's a great rhetorical genius in the back there. We should put him on this panel as well. So an attack on the right to vote is underway across the country through laws designed to make it more difficult to cast a ballot. We are in America. It should be easier, not more difficult. While couched in terms of voter fraud, how much fraud is there? Very small percentage. So ostensibly the argument is about fraud, but we know the bottom line, it's about region, it's about ethnicity, it's about race, it's about gender, it's about sexual orientation, it's about a bunch of that stuff. These laws will actually have their greatest impact by limiting participation of African Americans, Latinos, and the young. Some of the new laws, notably those limiting the number of days for early voting, have little plausible connection to battling fraud. You can vote more on Dancing with the Stars. Sorry, Tavis. Dancing with the Stars and American Idol than you can vote for your representatives in the United States of America. Something wrong with that, y'all. This Braintrust will explore nationwide voter suppression efforts and continue the dialogue on how to protect access to the ballot box from recent coordinated efforts to limit participation by protected classes of voters, particularly the minority, young, and elderly voters. I'm going to get right to the panel. I know some of the panelists have to leave earlier, so I'm going to start with Judith Brown. Diana's part of the Advancement Project. She's an extraordinary advocate for our interests as people. We were just on a panel together. So, and she did a heck of a job because she told us about what power we actually do possess and the skills that we should deploy in order to defend our interests as both people of color and as Americans more broadly. With the Advancement Project, extraordinarily well-trained, highly articulate, and please follow her on Twitter. She's trying to get her Twitter game up, and I want y'all to follow. What's your handle?
Jane Brown, that's Brown with an E, Dianis.
All right, Attorney Dianis, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Doctor. We had a good time on our last panel, so I have to make sure I don't say the same thing because he will call me out. So I want to thank you, Congressman Conyers, for having this important discussion. Ahmad and I have to leave, so I'm going to wait for him to do his, and then we're going to leave. But a few things. Shelby happened, and right after the Shelby County case came down, which meant that Section 5 was really taken out. And by taking it out, that meant that we didn't have protection in terms of the kinds of laws that get passed that had to be cleared through the Department of Justice before they could be implemented. We know if you wait, right, and let discrimination happen in voting, you get a president named George Bush. We know that you can't, you can change the outcomes of elections if you have discrimination in voting. And so what happened was right after that, we saw North Carolina pass what we call the monster voter suppression law. Now let's take this back. 50 years ago this year was Freedom Summer. More than 700 young people, white and black, went to Mississippi to work with folks on the ground in order to secure the right to vote. Many died. You may remember, if you didn't see the documentary Freedom Summer, you should check it out. Because one thing that we know is when the 3 civil rights workers were found, that when they looked in the river, there were lots of other bodies. And so it is clear, it's not too long ago. I wasn't born in '64, yay. But it was not too long ago that this happened, that young people died for the right to vote. And so in North Carolina, we've got a movement, the Moral Mondays movement, where Reverend Barber and other organizations, including the local NAACP, but other organizations throughout the state are fighting back. Because the thing is, we can't rely on the courts. We won our voter ID case in Pennsylvania, but we just recently lost our voter ID case in Wisconsin. And we lost our case in North Carolina, but they're both on appeal. So we can't wait. All right, we have to push on Congress to do a Voting Rights Act amendment, but let me tell you something. We can't have a Voting Rights Act amendment that doesn't include Florida and North Carolina in it. It doesn't go far enough. The only way to make it go far enough is if people in this room get activated and make sure that Congress does the right thing. The other thing we have to push for is a constitutional amendment for a right to vote. We have 13,000 election jurisdictions in this country that run elections 13,000 different ways. And we have to have an explicit right to vote in the Constitution that makes sure that the courts can't mess with our right to vote. And so I'm gonna leave it there. I want to, though, give a big shout out to the National Black Law Students Association. I'm a former chair. Gilda was also on the national board of the National Black Law Students Association, and they're co-sponsoring this panel. And the reason I want to give them a shout out, as well as the young people who are in the room, is that our world, and I'm talking to you all right now, our world has always been changed for the better because of the power of young people. And so you should know that while you may be young, you can change things. Thank you.
Thank you. That is Judith Brown Dianis. She has an extensive background in civil rights litigation and advocacy in the areas of voting, education, housing, and employment. And we thank her for her brief remarks. All right, we have to follow suit because we got a lot of folk to get in here. Next is Ahmad Nabil Abuznaid. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that.
We'll let it slide.
No.
Ahmed Nabil Abuznaid.
Abuznaid. All right, my brother. And so he co-authored a shadow report to the United Nations Human Rights Commission on Stand Your Ground Laws, Impacts on Minorities. got a Bachelor of Science in International Affairs from Florida State University and a Juris Doctor from Jacksonville, from the Florida Coastal School of Law. Quite able to speak to these issues as well. We'll give him a couple of minutes to weigh in, and we thank you very much.
Thank you very much, brother. First, I'd like to thank the Congressman for again hosting such an event where we can have this conversation. I would also like to thank the National Black Law Student Association. As a former member, I was not a national chair, wasn't able to get all the way up there, but certainly enjoyed my time and respect the ideals that the organization fights for. So I'm very thankful to have this opportunity. I work in the great state of Florida, where we've had our fair share of these issues regarding voting rights. Our current governor, after his most recent voter purge was exposed as a fraud, has rededicated himself to doing the same again. So we know that in the state of Florida, our leadership is not willing to listen to us at the moment. I actually forgot to thank the youth from Sankofa. I think, to be honest with you, some of these panels get a little bit redundant for me, and hearing them and their statements kept me grounded and took me back to really what we should be here for. I think there's a sense of dehumanization at the core of what's going on with these voter rights or lack of voter right laws that have been increasing across the country, because people are genuinely afraid of what would happen when people of color and minority communities have the power to change, to enforce the laws that they'd like to see, to elect the leaders that they'd like to see, to have police forces acting in the capacity that they'd like to see. I think that various panelists will talk about the identification issues with voting and those restrictions that come across in various states. One thing that for me in the state of Florida is a huge issue, and for the Dream Defenders is a huge issue, is felon disenfranchisement. And I know it's not directly related to some of these laws that have been enacted in the past few years, but we have over 1.2 million brothers and sisters in the state of Florida that cannot vote, because someone said that they made a mistake that they should be punished for throughout their lives. There's a candidate right now in the state of Florida who is saying that he would change that, and so we'll see if that candidate has an opportunity to be elected, if he will. But I think that the dehumanization is far-ranging, and not just attempting to limit your ability to begin voting, but attempting to forbid you from voting again if you commit such a mistake. Not only after serving your time in prison are you ostracized by people who do not want to employ you, but the very essence of democracy, your ability to participate in civic engagement, to be represented by those who say they represent you, is taken from you. So in the state of Florida, we have a huge battle, and so a group by the name of PICO, that maybe some folks in the room have heard of, have been leading this effort to basically re-engage the felons that have lost this right in the state of Florida. We know that, again, at the core is dehumanization of people of color, minority communities, LGBTQ, and the mentality that dehumanizes us is going to be the tough battle. I think, we can talk about policy changes, far-ranging. We need change in our people. Human beings need to interact with one another and see each other as human beings, and I think that's what gets lost, is that we have segregated communities that keep looking at each other as the others. And so they'll continue to be fearful, they'll continue to dehumanize us. So what we have to do is get out and vote, and know that not only are we voting for ourselves, but we're voting for 10 others that do not have the ability to vote. They don't have the identification required to vote. And they don't have the ability to stand at the polls all day. We have issues with early voting, having people out there all day. I remember reading an article in Miami, a woman well over the age of 90 years old spent about 8 hours in line on the days of early voting in Florida. That's just unacceptable. It's unacceptable for all of us. I would hate for my grandmother and my mother to be in line all day. I hate to be in line all day, because this is something that's supposed to be guaranteed to us at birth, these inalienable rights that we're supposed to have in this democratic society of the United States of America. So I want to say that not only are these voter ID laws troubling, but felon disenfranchisement is an issue in many states. These are millions of brothers and sisters who have paid their debt to society, that deserve their right in the civic process. I'm hoping we can be their voice, and we can be leading the way to get them back involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your exemplary brevity as well. And we excuse you to attend the restroom. Thank you for that. We've just had the great Congressman Steny Hoyer come into the room, and when we have, we're sure that he wants to say a few words. If not, we're going to ask him to say a few words to address us, because this is a passionate concern of his. Two legendary lawmakers sitting side by side. We've heard from the great John Conyers. Now we want to hear from Congressman Steny Hoyer. Thank you, sir.
I'm John Conyers' bag carrier, and I'm proud to be here. And when I came to Congress, I would stand out front of the Capitol back in '81 and '82 and '83 on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. John Conyers was leading the effort that America ought to stand up and recognize one of the great heroes of our history. So John Conyers has been my leader on so many of these issues. Nicole, of course, can vote to fire me, so I got to be nice to Nicole. I love Nicole. She's my buddy with Brennan Center. They do such a great work. And I want to thank all of you on this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, and young people, I like your ties. You look sharp. You look sharp. Thank you for being here. You know, we say we hold these truths to be self-evident. I tell people they may be self-evident, but they are not self-executing. I give a speech on responsibility, young people. It's a short speech. It's 10 words. They're all 2 letters. I want you to remember. If it is to be, it is up to me. Or it is up to us. I turned off the lights on that one. How about that? That was the emphasis. Apparently we got the screen up. I want to thank all of you. You know, when you don't have the votes, what you try to do is make sure that you vote when the others aren't there. When you don't have the votes, you try to shut out those who are not going to vote with you. The majority of votes in this country want to move it forward, and want to move it forward inclusively with all of us in the tent together, or all of us in the boat together, or all of us working together shoulder to shoulder to make America better. Young people, some people a lot older even than me, centuries ago said we were going to form a more perfect union. And young people, that perfect union meant that you would be fully included. I became a great-grandfather for the 3rd time yesterday at 5:19 a.m. Young people, she's a day old. She's counting on you to make her life better by participating, by speaking up, speaking out, acting up, acting out, and voting. And what we need to demand of all of those in power in America, that they do in a democracy what we ought to do. Not make it more difficult to vote, but to make it easier to vote. I'm proud to be a sponsor with John Conyers and John Lewis and other great leaders of the civil rights movement. I've walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge 13 times with John Lewis. Young people, John Lewis confronted state troopers as he crossed that bridge, and with 599 other people. And they were there solely for the purposes of stopping them march to do what? To register to vote. So they had a voice in their democracy, young people, and those troopers beat them back. Now I go over that bridge with John Lewis, and their troopers at the end of the bridge to protect us and to facilitate our movement. That was a very visible prevention of people voting. It's much more subtle today, and therefore more difficult to confront. And the Supreme Court has not helped us. The Supreme Court, astoundingly, young people said that things are better today. Not a problem today. In 2006, what you thought was the case, with 10,000 pages of testimony of problems that still exist, shutting out people because of their race, because of your color of your skin. Martin Luther King said it was the content of character that ought to matter. So young people, you're in a forum here with a lot of other people who are working to make sure that you are full participants and you are respected by your country as full voting participants in your country's future. So I want to thank all of you for being in this room. This is the best issues conference held every year in America. I'll say that in every forum I go to. It's the best issues forum held in America every year. With some of the most substantive information you're going to get any place in this country. Real experts who have a passion and a commitment to make life better for their country. Young people, I got into politics because of John Kennedy. 2 great speeches I heard in my life, and a lot of others I suppose. One was John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, the other was Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream. Now young people, if you haven't read the letter from Birmingham jail, it wasn't a speech. But that's the other great instructional text that you ought to use for your life. Working together to make America better. God bless all of you. Thank you very much.
All right, let's give Congressman Steny Hoyer another round of applause. Next up, we have Deborah Vargans, Senior Legislative Counsel at the ACLU Washington Legislative Office. She leads the Washington Legislative Office's civil rights advocacy efforts and develops proactive strategies on pending federal legislation and executive branch actions concerning racial justice, education, employment, discrimination, voting rights, and disability rights. She will be able to speak to us for her couple of minutes as well. Thank you.
Well, no one's ever complained that I'm quiet, so can you hear me? Yeah. There we go. Okay, all right. So thank you to Mr. Conyers and Mr. Hoyer. I appreciate that. I'm Deborah Vagans. I'm with the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office, and I want to quickly talk a little bit about Shelby, although I know you guys know a lot about Shelby and its aftermath, and also following up on Ahmad's comments, and I know we had to leave a little bit about criminal re-enfranchisement. So the ACLU has been litigating voting rights cases since 1965. We've filed more than 300 cases under the Voting Rights Act and the Constitution, and along with NAACP, LDF, and the Lawyers Committee, we were co-counsel in the Shelby case, where we represented the Alabama State NAACP and impacted voters. Besides the fact that the court took away one of the most incisive tools that we have to stop race discrimination in voting, I think one of the things that makes the court's decision so shocking, and the reason I'm focusing on this is I'm part of a team with many people up here trying to pass new legislation in Congress, doing the federal work while our team in the field continues to litigate. I think what's so shocking is that when you heard about the thousands of pages of record that we all created in 2006 and Mr. Conyers and Mr. Hoyer created, is that Congress is acting at the pinnacle of its power when it passes laws like that under the 14th and 15th Amendment. So this was an attack on Congress's authority to protect all of us. It not only dismantled the Voting Rights Act, but what I'm afraid of is what does this mean for other civil rights legislation when it gets before the Supreme Court? And not just because it's a conservative court, but it's a conservative court that virtually ignored what Congress did when it comes to protecting voters of color, but also because it's a conservative court that's not so conservative when it comes to judicial restraint, right? So back to this case, what remains, you might hear opponents saying when we're trying to pass legislation, well, what remains of the legal avenues are enough. We've got DOJ out there suing and many of our organizations suing, and that's just not true. There were things that we lost that don't exist in the Voting Rights Act or in any other voting rights protection. So things like being able to stop a change, a voting change, before it takes away your right to cast a ballot. We don't have that tool anywhere else, and if people tell you what we have is enough, it's not true. So for example, what's so different about this, and different than other types of civil rights laws, is let's take discrimination in employment and housing. Okay, so none of this is good, but if you approve an employment discrimination case or a housing discrimination case, you can get back pay, you can get money, you can get your job maybe back, you can get placed in an apartment. But once an election is over, it's over, right? It's over. There's nothing you can do. So that's why we need these tools back in place to be able to freeze voting changes before they can take your right away. That's what the legislation does. I'll talk about it in a second. And also, we lost an incredible tool, which was letting the people know about these nefarious last-minute changes. The only way we have to know about the changes now is if people are paying attention. And even if you're paying attention, it's hard to find out about these. There was a tool in the Voting Rights Act that would let us know jurisdictions had to report their changes, and now they don't. So this last January, Mr. Conyers, Republican member of the House, James Sensenbrenner, and in the Senate, Senator Leahy introduced the Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2014. You heard from Judith, the bill is not perfect, but it goes beyond, it answers Chief Justice Roberts' call to look at current discrimination, to keep it modern, to keep it flexible. It gives us new tools. It tries to recreate some of the old tools that I talked about that are incredibly important. And it is trying to make sure that we can target discrimination wherever it occurs in the United States. But here's where we need your help. It's bipartisan, and even though it's bipartisan, it is stuck in Congress. So this is very disappointing because every time the Voting Rights Act has come up, members of both parties from across the country have come together to pass it. They have overwhelmingly passed the Voting Rights Act 4 times, overwhelmingly bipartisan. Of the last 3 extensions of the Voting Rights Act, they have been signed by Republican presidents. There's always been something uniquely different about the Voting Rights Act that has allowed it to survive during even our most bitterly partisan times. But right now it's stuck. And why I think it's stuck is, I know people in this room, there's been an outcry from people in this room and people who really care, but there hasn't been enough of a public outcry, despite lots of groups up here working. The political pressure has not been enough to sway members of Congress from their inaction. And to be honest, I think the bill was very modest because it was bipartisan, right? It was bipartisan. The court said all these other things you're trying are unconstitutional, so you have to keep within the constitutional constraints. So maybe it's not the perfect bill, but we are not in that perfect world. We are all mourning the loss of Section 5 and those broad protections, but we're in a post-Shelby environment now. So what I say is the comparison is not between this legislation and the legislation that we lost, which is so sacrosanct, but it's between this legislation, which is trying to repair some of the damage, and the fact that we have nothing now that has those same types of tools. We have nothing now, that we're going to be going into the first election in 50 years without robust protections for voters of color. Congress has to hear that outcry, that is not going to stand. And so they are not, and I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but because they're not feeling heat for their lack of action, I feel like what's happening is they feel that there is more political risk for them to move the bill forward than to not move it forward. So until we can flip that equation, until they can feel that there are political consequences and accountability for not having robust protections in place, then there'll be no more protections in place. So we can't really blame them. Well, okay, we can blame them, right? We can blame them, but we have to raise our voices and demand these protections. And I know I'm going way too long, but quickly I want to say, and I'm going to sound like, I'm an optimist, so I'm going to sound like a pessimist, but, so that's the frustration on the Voting Rights Act. But let's say we even pass the Voting Rights Act. Even with that, there are 6 million Americans, so even if we could pass the best Voting Rights Act in America, there are 6 million Americans who can't vote, and that's because they have criminal convictions in their past. 4.4 million of them are in our communities, working, paying taxes, and you've heard from my fellow speaker that these laws came about, proliferated during Jim Crow, and were targeted to disfranchise African American voters. And so we've got a big problem. There's also legislation that Mr. Conyers has sponsored, the Democracy Restoration Act, and that bill would provide a bright line test. If you are not incarcerated, you can register and you can vote. It would ensure that probationers never lose the right to vote. It would help rebuild ties to community. Law enforcement, we work with the Brennan Center. The law enforcement and faith community are with us and working on this. It's critically important. We've got bipartisan support for these types of laws in the states. And so I just want to end by saying that the last thing is, while we need your help to work on this federal legislation, the fact is that there are bad laws on the books right now. So we still need your help. We need you to help people get out there. Please volunteer to be poll workers, volunteer for election protection, help get folks registered where they can, and even though we don't like them, help people get ID if you can help them, if they can do it. And you're going to hear more probably from Tanya about election protection efforts. So we won't stop fighting for the federal changes, but don't let those that would deny our right to vote win. Thank you.
Thank you. Y'all forget my old school spirit, but I see men sitting and women standing. I don't know, just how I was raised in Detroit. If we can very quickly have some young men, not the older brothers, some of the younger bucks, stand up and let the ladies sit down. All right, there's some seats over here as well. Y'all just want to stand on the wallflowers? I see. See, that's what the young boys tell me, man, you don't know. I'm trying to be a gentleman. I've been trying, man. You don't know. They don't want to do it. All right. So next up is Nicole Austin Hillary, the first director and counsel of the Brennan Center's Washington, D.C. office. I believe Attorney General Holder delivered his remarks at the Brennan office in New York City. So. In her role, Ms. Austin Hillary has overseen the growth and development of the Brennan Center's advocacy and policy development work in Washington. She's the organization's chief liaison to Congress and the administration. And she, of course, as well is active in many civic and social organizations. She's a former Wasserstein Public Interest Fellow at Harvard Law School and serves on the board of Washington Bar Association. Ms. Austin Hillary.
Now, you've heard a lot about what's wrong, what the problems are. I want to tell you a little bit about what the good news is, because there is still some good news, despite the fact that it doesn't seem like there is. There is still some good news out there. And as my colleague Deborah Vagans just said, we have to be armed with knowledge. The only way that we can stop the progression of efforts to make it harder for Americans to register to vote and to vote is to arm ourselves with the knowledge that we need in order to fight against that push. So I want to talk to you about some of that. In 2011, the Brennan Center issued a report called The State of Voting in 2011 and 2012. And that report sounded an alarm bell, if you will. That report laid out every legislature, every state legislature in the country that had introduced some type of legislation that would have the effect, if it were passed into law, would have the effect of making it harder for individuals to either register to vote or to indeed cast their ballot in the voting booth. And do you know the groups of people that were going to be most impacted by those laws? They were people of color, They were the elderly, they were the poor, and they were students. These are the people that were going to be most impacted by these laws. As a result of that report and the public education campaign that ensued thereafter, many people around the country used that information and they educated themselves, their communities. People were in churches talking about these numbers, these statistics, what was going on around the country. And what happened is you all, Americans all across the country, rose up and they said, with this knowledge, we are going to make sure that voters know what they need to know about IDs or any other new laws that are going to be introduced. We are not going to stay home and we are not going to be stopped at the polls. And we were, for the most part, successful in fighting back against those laws. Now, you've already heard Judith Brown Dianis, and you've heard others talk about the fact that we are still fighting these battles. We have not won it all. I want to tell you about where we are now in 2014 with respect to the state of voting. Here are 4 things that you need to know. Since the 2010 election, new voting restrictions are slated to be in place in 22 states. So that means 22 states in this country that did not have certain voting restrictions in place on the books will now have them on the books for the first time since 2010. Second key thing I want you to remember. In 15 states, 2014 will be the first major federal election with these new restrictions in place. So that means when people voted the last time in a major federal election, there were some laws that were not on the books that will now be on the books now. Folks need to know what they are. They need to be educated about them. Third thing I want you to remember, we still are fighting battles in the courts. There are 7 states that have major ongoing lawsuits that are underway right now, and you've heard some talk about them in North Carolina and Wisconsin. You need to know that the battle is still being waged in the courts. Now here's the really, really good news, and the 4th thing I want you to remember, if you remember nothing else that I've said to you today. 16 states across the country have new laws on the books that are making it easier for people to vote. Thank goodness. 16 states. Let me tell you quickly what some of those states are, because I want you to remember, some of them may be yours. And these are my favorite 3, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. That just kind of rolls off the tongue. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. Those are 3 of the states that have new voting restrictions that will be in place since 2010. Then we have North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas. I need the young people. Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to tell you this. The Brennan Center has a report that we put out. We're known for putting out a lot of intellectual reports because, again, we want to arm you with knowledge. This report is called The State of Voting in 2014. Everything that I'm telling you, if you get this report, and you can get it on our website, Brennan, B-R-E-N-N-A-N, center.org, you can get that information. But you need to know whether one of these states is your state. Now, what kinds of changes are in place in these states? It's not just that you need to know that there are some new voting restrictions in place, you need to know what they deal with. In 13 of those states, they have passed more restrictive voter ID laws. And we all know what these are. You've heard about them. This is probably the thing that we've talked about the most. States where they are trying to get people to show forms of ID in order to cast their ballot on election day. And understand this, folks. When people talk about voter ID, and most of us up here have problems with voter ID, but understand this. The main problem with voter ID is not just that they're asking you to show an ID, it's that they're asking you to show a certain type of ID. Now I know if I came out to each of you and said, let me see a cute purse, sister, or let me see that wallet, brother, and asked you what's in it, something in that wallet or that purse would tell me who you are. It might be your ACE check cashing card, it might be your driver's license, it might be your ID from college. But you've got something on you that tells me who you are. Well, unfortunately, many of these state legislatures said that's not good enough. They have said, you must show us a particular kind of ID. And of course, the list of IDs that many of these states have asked for are IDs that people of color, students, the elderly, and the poor tend not to have. That is the real problem with voter ID, so you all need to be clear on that. In 10 states, they've passed laws making it harder for citizens to register to vote. So that's one of the problems too. In 8 states, they've passed laws cutting back on early voting days. And we all know how important early voting days are, because many of us do not have the luxury of standing in line for hours on that first Tuesday in November. We don't all have the luxury of calling our employers and saying, I'm going to be late because I've got to cast my ballot, because they might say, if you're going to be late, just keep on going, don't show up tomorrow either. We all can't live that way, so we know that being able to vote on Sunday before election or that Saturday before election day is important, but there are 8 states that have made that harder. And in 3 states, and this is touching on what my colleague Deb Vegas just mentioned to you, in 3 states they've made it harder for the formerly incarcerated to vote. So these are the problems in these various states. And let me tell you one other thing that you need to know about. In terms of the 16 states that have actually made it easier for people to register to vote, you need to know about those too. Guess what? They're not Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. But Mississippi is one of them, believe it or not. Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Minnesota, Nebraska, Missouri, Illinois, West Virginia, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Those are the 16 states that have made it easier for people to actually engage in the democratic voting process. So you need to know about those. And let me tell you also finally about this. In terms of the states that have expanded these laws, here are the ways in which they've expanded laws. Voter registration modernization. This is a concept that the Brennan Center, working with the Lawyers Committee and some of our other colleagues, helped to put into place. Voter registration modernization is a theory that says if you make it easier for people to register to vote and indeed cast their ballot, we will expand the franchise. We will get more Americans to the polls. And that's really what the history of this country is about. You need to understand this. If you go back to the Reconstruction, the history of this country has really been about expanding access to the ballot box. It is just in this recent history that we have had folks who were not wise enough to know this and who were actually trying to make it harder for people to engage in our democratic process. That is not what we do as a country. We're about including more people. So 11 states have passed laws making it easier for eligible citizens to register. 3 states have expanded their early voting hours. We've had another 3 states that have passed laws allowing pre-registration. That means for 16 and 17-year-olds who can actually pre-register. Because guess what? If you lay that groundwork, guess what's going to happen when they turn 18? They're going to go out there and they're going to register. At least 1 state's passed a constitutional amendment expanding opportunities for the formerly incarcerated to vote. Another state has eased restrictions on voter ID. And at least 3 states have expanded access to the ballot box. So these are the things that you need to know, and I'm going to stop there because I see Brother Dyson giving me the old, giving me the old hook, the snake eye and the hook like they give you at the Apollo. But again, go to the Brennan Center website. You will see this information. And lastly, hot off the presses, we put out a report this week on long lines. The president said, when he issued his last State of the Union address, or the one in 2013, that this long lines problem is an issue. You need to read about that, and you need to read about what can be done in your local jurisdictions to help ease long lines. I will stop there, but again, remember, I'm giving you the good news. Things are changing. As long as we arm ourselves with knowledge, that is our power, that is what we need to do around the country and in our communities to help fight back against these attacks. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We need the good news. So good cop, bad cop. We can deal with that. Emphasis on cop. But you're right. I mean, why don't we have a national holiday where people just get off and vote and get paid for it? Why can't we be just enlightened, right? And like Monty, we're subject to the Monty Hall. What's in your purse? You know, let me pay you for that. You know, I mean, even your welfare card, SNAP card. I'm sorry, I'm going back to my youth. Or that women, infants, and children card, right? Amen. So, great presentation. Let's go now to Professor Gilda Daniels of the Baltimore School of Law. She's an associate professor of law there, where she teaches critical legal theory, election law, and civil procedure. She's a voting rights expert and national speaker. She served as a deputy chief in the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division. Maybe we can just get her to head that division right now, because they're having a hard time trying to hook some people up for that position. In the voting section under the Clinton and Bush administrations, her scholarship focuses on the intersections of race, law, and democracy. Professor Daniels.
Thank you, Dr. Dyson, and thank you so much to Congressman Conyers for the invitation, and I'm so happy to be here with my colleagues. I have to tell you that I am the daughter and granddaughter of Baptist preachers, so I need y'all to holler at your girl. Only a few minutes, I need y'all to holler at your girl. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about 3 things. I'm going to talk to you about Congress, talk to you about the Supreme Court, and then we're going to talk about voter participation in the very few minutes that Dr. Dyson has given me. First, do you know that Congress is getting whiter while the country is getting browner? Okay, so the 113th Congress certainly has political parity between the two parties, with about 233 Republicans and 205 Democrats in the House, and in the Senate there are 45 Republicans, 53 Democrats, and 2 independents. But 80% of Congress is white, and 19% is minority. Now, if you look at the House Republicans, 89% of House Republicans are white men. And white men are only 36% of U.S. residents. Only 36%, but they're 89% of the Republicans in the House are white men. And so there are only 42 African-American members of the House and 2 in the Senate, 37 Hispanic, 13 Asian American, 2 American Indians, all in the House. But the overwhelming majority of the House is white America, while we are certainly becoming a much beiger and browner United States. Now, they can already project that the gender and racial gap between the parties will get even higher or even wider after this midterm election, which occurs in November. Because in less than 2 months to go, they're already saying that only 10% of the 435 House seats are considered competitive. That's 43 seats out of 435, right? And so they're projecting again that the House, that you'll have even more disparities in regards to race. Now, Republicans may certainly have a lot of control on the House, in part because they've succeeded in drawing districts that are much wider than the nation as a whole. And there's a Supreme Court case that's going to be heard on November 12th that deals with the use of race in redistricting. Those 2 cases coming from Alabama. There are 2 cases from Alabama. The Alabama Democratic Conference versus Alabama, and the Alabama Legislative Black Caucus versus Alabama. Deb talked about Shelby County, which was also from Alabama. Congressman Cindy Hoyer talked about Selma. Lord Jesus, if Alabama didn't give us the Voting Rights Act, they are certainly trying to take it away, all the way away. Because in this case, you have the caucuses, the Democratic caucus and the Legislative Black Caucus arguing that the congressional map was, the state legislative map is a racial gerrymander. That the state unjustifiably relied on the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, as well as that they decided to make the black districts supermajorities. So where they were 55%, they decided to make them 75% African American, right? And so they pushed like the 20% or more of black population into districts that were already majority black. So what's going to happen in Alabama is what's certainly is happening in places like South Carolina and North Carolina, where the Democratic caucus will soon equal the black caucus in the state legislature. So the only Democrats that are being elected are those that are African American, because they're pushing all the black population into these majority minority districts. And what legislators are saying, what black legislators are saying, is that we don't need 75% of African Americans in our district, that we can have influence in other districts so that we can impact certainly the fact that the Congress is getting whiter while the country is getting browner. That we don't want to dilute the vote such that we have no impact in our vote, that our vote has no power. But what Alabama's arguing, the Alabama Democratic Caucus is arguing, is that they went too far. Now, there are a couple of problems here. One is that I don't know that we want this Supreme Court to look at the issue of race and redistricting. Whenever they hear the word, it just, I don't know, Roberts just gets chills up his spine. Scalia, that's right, and Lord Jesus, Justice Thomas, if he's awake, we'll have to figure out whether or not, he's paying attention. But here, if the Congress, if the Supreme Court actually when the Supreme Court looks at this issue, certainly Justice Kennedy is seen as key, right? And whether that, hopefully, there is a way out short of saying that you cannot use race in the issue of redistricting, which is certainly the worst that could happen. And I talked to a former Supreme Court clerk a week ago, and she said that what the court tends to do is have a minimalist, maximalist approach. Well, they'll take a case and then a few years later take another case. For example, like the Mudno case, we looked at Section 5, but the court said, we'll just do a little bit here. We won't do a whole lot. And then 2 years later, they got the Shelby case and said, you know what, we're done with this. We don't even want to deal with Section 5. And that's the fear with this Alabama case, is that here they take the minimalist approach and say, well, Alabama should not have relied on Section 5. But there's another case coming up, and that's North Carolina is working its way up to the Supreme Court, and then they could take this minimalist, maximalist approach. And we certainly don't want that, and we certainly don't want them to revisit how the use of race and redistricting. Now, Sid, I want to talk to you about voter participation because the Alabama case is directly related to the phenomenon that Congress is getting whiter while the country is getting browner. And yes, it is related to the highly partisan redistricting process, but until we can change that, what can we do about it? Everybody's already said, educate, educate, educate. That is key. You need to find out what is the redistricting process where you live, in your state, in your county, in your city, right? Or on the school board. What is it? An appointed task force? Is it a commission? Does the legislature handle the redistricting process? And I also want you to get ready, right? We're mid-year, right? So once you mid-decade, need you to start thinking about how you can submit a plan. Right? How can you review a plan? And I also want you people to start thinking about running for office. Run for federal office, run for state office, run for your local offices. And certainly we've already talked about registering to vote, register to vote, and then register others. But in all of this, turnout is key. Now, the projections that Congress will get wider is built on what the turnout has been in the past. For midterm elections, turnout was 40% in 2010. 40%, 40, in 2010. 2012, you had a turnout of about 56%, and for the first time, African Americans turned out at a higher rate than whites. For the first time, right? And so, and so it can be done. So you can change the outcome by registering people to vote and turning out. And young people are key because young people are less likely to vote during midterm elections than the presidential election. So young people certainly need to turn out. One last thing. A week ago in Scotland, they had a vote on independence. 84% turnout. 84%. It was 5 people who stayed home. Right? So 84%. So can you imagine what this country would look like if you had that level of participation? Right? And we have a number of barriers, and certainly we're talking about those and their rights to conquer those. But in this battle, we have to arm ourselves with knowledge and action. Right? The Bible says you need to fight and pray. So I need you to fight and pray and vote and register and vote. Okay? Thank you.
I like that hermeneutical approach
Praise him.
to watch and pray. You turn it to fight and pray. I like that. I like that. I like that even better. Jesus was probably saying, let's fight, and in a rhetorical sense. Great presentation and very timely reminders for us as well. Maybe if we could get Beyonce involved, we'd have a 90% turnout. I would. I'd show up agency. Okay. And Jay-Z. All right. If we can get Bishop Jakes not to sue the rappers, it would be great. You can't sue the conscious rappers. You cannot sue the rappers who know who T.D. Jakes is.
That's right.
Right? I mean, if they don't know you, that's what. If they know who you are, don't sue them.
That's right.
Kendrick Lamar is Charles Dickens with a microphone in the hood. All right? I just got to say this one thing and I'll shut up. So Reinhold Niebuhr, pastor of the church in Detroit in 1913, maybe wrote an excellent book, but he also subsequently became a world-famous theologian, taught at Union Theological Seminary, wrote a book called Moral Man, Immoral Society. Kendrick Lamar has an album called Good Kid, Mad City. See the parallel? The individual being seduced by the group. That's all he's talking about. And cussing? You don't know how to cuss till you talk to a preacher. I'm just giving out guild secrets up in here. The most creative cussing I've ever heard were from ministers and, you know, priests. I'm just telling you now. I'm just being real with you. So what's more profane? The obscenity of the condition they confront or the language they use to express it. And I love T.D. Jakes. He's a rhetorical genius, but don't sue your kids. Talk to them. Engage them. Be glad somebody want to talk about you in another generation to tell them your name. You can sell some more books. If the point is prosperity. And commercialism above spiritual engagement. I know that's not true, but just in case somebody said it. Professor Spencer Overton is a specialist in voting rights and campaign finance. Don't charge none of this to Congressman John Conyers. This is all on me. He's a gentleman and would never say that. All right. He is the director of the Political Law Studies Initiative. His academic articles on election law have appeared in several leading law journals, including the Texas Law Review, the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, and the Michigan Law Review. Professor Overton's extraordinary book, Stealing Democracy, The New Politics of Voter Suppression, was published and released by W.W. Norton. Let me finally say, during his time in the Obama campaign transition administration from 2007 to 2010, he was a key leader on the administration's landmark efforts to curb special interests, enhance transparency, and increase citizen participation. Professor Spencer Overton.
Thank you, Professor Dyson. Appreciate that. Also want to thank Congressman Conyers. Thank you so much for being such a great leader. We just appreciate you so much. Michael Brown. After a white police officer shot and killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, we talked a lot about Ferguson's government, which was overwhelmingly white. You'll remember in Ferguson, the mayor's white, 5 of the 6 city council members are white, 50 of the 53 police officers, they're white. But we also know that 67% of the town of Ferguson is black, right? So we say, why? Right? So now, while white and African American residents were about equally likely to vote in the presidential election, whites were 3 times more likely than black folks to vote in the local elections. That's why. Right? Now this is not just a Ferguson issue. This illustrates one of the most significant issues that we really don't talk about really of our time. Nationwide, presidential election turnout is about 60%. For local elections, the average is 27%. In a lot of places, it's as low as 10% and sometimes lower. Just like in Ferguson, as turnout declines, it frankly becomes more white and less representative, right? So now we've all focused on statewide barriers like photo identification and felon disenfranchisement, and these are important, you know. So 3% of voting age Americans can't vote as a result of a felony. 11% of Americans lack a photo ID or voting age. But 33% of voting aged Americans vote in national elections, but not local elections. And those people who don't vote in local elections, they're disproportionately black. Okay? While African Americans, they represent 12% of the population, one study found that there are only 4% of city council people, 4% of mayors. Now, you may say, hey, this isn't important, it's just a local thing, right? But local officials allocate almost $2 trillion in terms of spending, right? They deal with police, right? We talk about discriminatory enforcement, schools, right? We talk about tracking, other issues, right? They're really important. You might say, hey, this isn't important because we got a black mayor in Atlanta, in Baltimore, in DC, right? But we've had some major demographic changes. You know, now that over 50% of black folks live in suburbs, right? Not in Atlanta, not in Baltimore, in places like Ferguson, right? So now some people say, hey, this is a big issue. the black people are just too lazy to vote, but you know, turnout among white folk is also lower in local elections, right? So it's not that's not the issue. And really, is saying that black folks are just too lazy to turn out in local elections any different than saying that they're just too lazy to get a photo ID? Right? I think that both of those arguments are flawed. Now, don't get me wrong. We got to hold folks accountable. We got to get out. We got to participate, right? But I'm just saying that the problem is solely not, the answer is solely not to get out the vote drive, which might not extend outside of Ferguson, which may not extend past an election cycle. In addition to mobilizing black voters, we need to look at the structure of elections. People who disenfranchise black voters, they know about the structure. 2010, Augusta, Georgia, right? They knew turnout was higher in November than July, so what they do, they moved the election from November back to July. They understand this, right? Shouldn't we design a structure where people are actually likely to show up to vote? Right now, 94% of local elected officials are elected not during a presidential election. I think we need to think about, just think about, moving local elections to coincide, same time as presidential elections. This would add 80 million voters to local elections. It would add 7,500 African American elected officials. I think it would start to resolve some issues like discriminatory police enforcement and educational opportunities. So now, maybe you have a different idea, and I look forward to talking to you about it, but whatever answer we come up with, we got to realize that turnout in these local elections, it's important. We definitely need strong federal enforcement of civil rights. Came in the beginning of the Obama administration, worked for Attorney General Holder, in the policy shop. I love him. We need federal enforcement, right? We definitely need. We need leaders in Congress like John Conyers. We need federal enforcement and strong federal laws, right? But we also need to focus on local election laws to protect civil rights.
Amen, amen. That local is extremely important, because those are folk that be putting us in jail on the local level. Minimum mandatory sentences that Holder has been arguing against. The local level determines a lot of our existence, and we cannot ignore it. Down to the final two. 4? Who's up? Oh, okay. I did not see. Okay. Did y'all come up after I started? I did not see it. Who was that on the end down there? Tiny player. Yes, ma'am. All right. And who was that next to him? Okay, man. Well, let me while I introduce Brother Hebert. Is it Hebert or Hebert? It's Hebert. Okay. We'll act like we're French and go Hebert. Brother Hebert is J. Gerald Hebert is a sole practitioner in Alexandria, Virginia, who specializes in election law and redistricting. His legal practice is national in scope. He represents clients like many local governments that we've been speaking about: Alabama, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia. And over the last 3 decades, he served as legal counsel for parties and amici curiae. Am I saying that right? Amici curiae. No. In numerous redistricting lawsuits, including several cases decided in the Supreme Court of the United States. We'll invite him now to talk to us a bit. His most recent publications include Redistricting in the Post-2000 Era, in the George Mason University Law Review, and The Realistic Guide to Redistricting, published by the American Bar Association section of Administrative Law and Regulatory Practice. All right.
So thank you, Congressman Conyers, one of my heroes, and so many battles we've been through over the years, and they continue, unfortunately. And I want to thank you for convening this important conference. We've heard a lot about Shelby County. I was going to show a PowerPoint, but I decided I'm fresh from Texas. I just got done trying the Texas photo ID case, on behalf of Congressman Mark Vesey, African-American congressman from Fort Worth, who stood up for what he believed in, which is that the Texas photo ID law is discriminatory not only in its impact, but in its purpose. And we just had a 2-week trial. We're waiting on the court to make a decision, and she's indicated she'll rule in all likelihood before the election, and we're asking the court to enjoin that law. And let me tell you a little bit about how it came about. Shelby County, as you all know from last year, gutted a central part of the Voting Rights Act. And as soon as that decision came down, within 2 hours, the Texas Attorney General tweeted, "The photo ID law is now in effect." Previously blocked by the Voting Rights Act and found by federal judges to be racially discriminatory against blacks and Latinos, the Texas Attorney General said, now we're going to enforce it. We're not going to try to fix it. Wouldn't that have been a responsible thing to do, to try to ameliorate the problems with the law? But no, we're going to go ahead and shove it down people's throats. You know, 32 million people have voted in Texas in the last 14 years. And Texas claims that they needed a photo ID law because it will prevent voter impersonation fraud. Now, think about voter impersonation fraud. When I go to vote for Reverend Anthony here, and I show up at the polls to vote his vote, I gotta hope that they don't know that I'm not Reverend Anthony. They also I have to hope they don't know him, because if they know him, they know I ain't him. Now, in addition, I have to hope he hasn't voted already, because if he did and I try to vote for him, then I'm in trouble. And I'm committing voter fraud in front of a handful of government officials. Does any of that make sense to anybody in this room? Of course not. And if I do, when I get caught, I get 10 years felony conviction. Now, that's why it doesn't happen. 32 million votes cast in the last 14 years in Texas. 2 examples of people who tried to impersonate another. A father for a son and a brother for a brother. That's it. So we're going to disenfranchise 650,000 people in Texas because 2 people did a stupid thing? What about the 600,000 people who we proved in court don't have the ID necessary to vote? What about those people? And what about the fact that twice as many people in Texas who lack an ID happen to be Latino? And how about the fact that 3 times as many people who lack the ID happen to be African American? And we proved all that to the satisfaction, I hope, of the federal court. So, Texas's defense was, well, yeah, we made a lot of mistakes when we implemented this photo ID bill because we had to do it in a rush. No, they didn't. They could have fixed it. They didn't have to say 2 hours later, we're going to go ahead and implement the law. You know what they said? They said, well, we had to build an airplane while we were trying to fly it. Well, how about building it first and then flying it? Because you know what happened? When they tried to implement the law so quickly, they didn't realize that, you know where voter registration takes place now in Texas? Not at the voter registration office. You get down there to register to vote, they give you a little card. Doesn't have your picture on it. You can't use it to vote. The voter registration offices are obsolete. You now got to go down to something called the Department of Public Safety, which is a law enforcement agency, to get the photo ID you need to vote. Now the problem with that is they fingerprint you when you go to the DPS, the Department of Public Safety. So they started to fingerprint people who said, gee, I want to get the ID so I can vote. Then they announced that they would, if you had any outstanding tickets or warrants, they were going to pull those up. So who do you think went down there to do that? Well, you know what? In Georgia, in 6 months after their photo ID law, they issued 2,700 free photo IDs. Texas has been at it for a year, and it's a lot bigger than Georgia, and they've issued a grand total of 279 free IDs. And you know what? Here's another thing. The IDs aren't free. In order to get the so-called free ID in Texas, you have to present a birth certificate. Birth certificates cost $22. That's a poll tax. When I started practicing law 40 years ago, and I was working in Selma and other places, we had a situation where people were being denied the right to vote. Then we kind of solved all those problems and we went into the dilution cases, where we had to try to get districts drawn for African Americans in the Deep South. Now we're back to the denial cases. Who would have thought that we were to turn the clock back to where people are being denied the right to vote? So I say to you, yeah, there's a lot of good news and there's a lot of bad news. A lot of these cases over the years we've been able to win in the courts. Our country is the first country on earth that was founded with a purpose. And certain phrases that we've come to believe in as Americans, whether you're African American, Latino, Native American, or white, certain phrases ring songs in every American heart. Phrases like, give me liberty or give me death. Govern by the consent of the governed. All men are created equal. You see, the enemies are not the black voters who lack the ID, or the Latino voters who have the ID. Those aren't our enemies. Our enemies are poverty, disease, ignorance. Those are the enemies we should be fighting, but instead we have to fight these cases in court. Well, I say that every voter who lacks an ID, that their cause has to be everybody in this room's cause. Because we have to stick together to fight this fight, because the other side is sticking together to fight against us. And we need to fight our true enemies. At the end of the day, you've heard it for decades now, they all say it's about states' rights. And I say it's not about states' rights. It's about human rights. It's about civil rights. It's about voting rights. On that, we can all agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brother Hebert. Now we're down to our final three. All right. Tanya Clayhouse, Director of Public Policy for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Under law, Mrs. House works closely with all committee projects focusing on core issues such as education, voting rights, employment discrimination, fair housing, affirmative action, criminal justice, immigration, and other racial diversity issues. She formerly served as the Public Policy Director at the People for the American Way, also as Policy Liaison for the African American Ministers Leadership Council. She's formerly of Louisville, Kentucky, got her BA cum laude in political science from the University of Michigan, where she excelled as a varsity track athlete. What particular, did you run or throw? What did you do?
800.
800. And the what mile?
The mile relay.
Oh, that's the wrong woman's race right there. That's big time right there. She earned her JD from the University of Texas School of Law in 1999, where she's executive editor of the Texas Journal of Women and the Law and attorney general for the Rocky Mountain Black Law Students Association. She resides outside of D.C. in Springfield, Virginia, with her husband Damon and the young sons Dylan and Tyler. All right, we'll welcome her to the microphone now.
Thank you. I don't think, is this working? Yeah. All right, so good afternoon. Good afternoon. I had a couple of slides, but I'm going to just let it go because I don't really know how that's working up there. But I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to give you some resources. We've heard a lot of information, and I want to continue to educate. But I also want to make sure, as we're educating, we're telling you what you can do with this information. We have, a short time before the upcoming elections. And we're telling you some good news, and we're telling you some bad news, and we're telling you just the reality of the situation. It is what it is. So now we've got to pick up the pieces and figure out how it is we're going to make sure that we're protecting our right to vote and ensuring that we're not allowing others to take that right away from us or any of our family members or friends. So before I do that, I have to acknowledge my sister who is over there. Where did she go? Did she leave already? My sister was here, but I don't know where she went. But I usually have to acknowledge her because she never comes, so she just left me again. So when she comes in, don't worry, I will make sure you see that she left and came back. So I wanted to make sure that I focused on a few things that I think we need to do this election season and throughout the year. What we heard already is that we no longer have the coverage of Section 4, the formula in the Voting Rights Act. Therefore, that has taken away a number of things. Not only the oversight that the Department of Justice had over a lot of these southern states, and some, mostly southern states, but a lot of other states and jurisdictions to make sure that they didn't enact discriminatory voting laws, but we lost other things with that as well, and one of those protections we lost was the ability to make sure that we had federal observers in these states. And I think that's a little known fact that doesn't necessarily get spoken about that much. People don't realize how important that is. We are obviously arguing to make sure that we can still have that protection regardless, but there is a concern, and so therefore we, as a result, have to prepare ourselves and arm ourselves to do that work. And part of that is educating everybody about how it is that you can identify voting, problems, throughout, before and on election day. And so the Lawyers Committee has been working with many of our coalition members through the Election Protection Coalition, which I'm going to talk more about. But first I want to talk to you about how we've been working to make sure that we're conducting town halls and these trainings with all of you. We're working through the churches, we're working through our community civic organizations, and so we produce what we call toolkits. And you can get this information, it's outside on the booth, and I want to make sure you all pick all this stuff up, the pamphlets and all this information, and take as many as you want. Give them to people that you know. Because these toolkits are not only available for what we call the faith community to kind of educate and say, look, this is how you can have a town hall. We will come in and we'll train. You call, we'll travel. And we will make sure that you have the information at your disposal. We'll tell you where you need to go. You need to be at this local council in order to find out what's going on in your community. We're going to tell you, okay, you need to make sure that you go to this school board. You need to make sure that you go to these various meetings, because this is where you're going to find out information about what's happening within your locality, where polling place changes may be occurring, if there's situations about the voting ballot that you may not be aware of. If there are different changes that are being made within the election, you need to know. Because see, right now, there's no uniform way to send this information up to people like us and to the federal government to say, okay, wait a minute, this might actually be discriminatory. So that's why we're out there on the field right now. And we're trying to train to say, look, we've got to tell you what to look for. Now we need you to tell other people what to look for, and we need you to be our eyes and ears. So that's what these voting rights trainings are about. So I wanted to make sure you knew about that, and to get that information out. You can get that at our website at lawyerscommittee.org, and you can also get the pamphlets. All that information is out there. Additionally, as I said, we not only are trying to train you on how to look for these issues, then we've got to show you, okay, what to do. Not only to report this information up and say, look, now we also need you to be at the polling place, or we need to make sure that you are helping to protect others as they're going to vote. Not only do you need to go vote, but we need you to help protect others. So, Election Protection Coalition, I think that many people are hopefully by now have become familiar with a lot of these we call voter protection efforts. The Election Protection Coalition was founded right after the 2000, what we call the debacle of the 2000 elections. I don't care who you voted for, it was still a debacle. What happened should never have happened. The Supreme Court should not decide an election. But as a result of the 2000 elections, we decided, you know what, we can't rely upon the federal government or anybody else to only protect our vote, and we've got to make sure that we're out there. And so the Election Protection Coalition was formed. It's a combination of pretty much everybody up here and all the rest of the organizations that you can probably think of. And what we do is we train people to be poll monitors on the ground. We have a hotline, 1-866-R-VOTE, which is a national hotline, which is live now. You all should know this. This 1-866-R-VOTE number is live. You can call there not only to get information about how you register to vote, how, whether or not, where your polling place is, if there have been changes about voter ID. You can call there to get whatever help you need, and we will help to guide you. So you have people who are answering that phone now. And it goes on and all through the election. And we also have various websites that you can get information, but we also have this tool that I have to talk about. It's a smartphone app, because we recognize that not everybody likes to call. A lot of the young people, younger than me, don't talk, they text. And you look at a phone and you say, okay, well, I need to find this information. And so we've got a smartphone app that you can get this information as well. You can text right now, EP app, to 90975, and you can get this app for the Election Protection Coalition. And it'll help you get all this information that I talk about right on your phone. You can call Ray and say, look, are you registered? If not, let me find out if you're registered. And you can find that out on your phone. And then you can help to get them registered, all right? And so this is at your disposal. But we need all of you all to help volunteer. Because while we're talking about all these issues that are going on, we need you to get out there and help us, okay? Because we just, as I said, we've got to take responsibility for what's going on right now. And the fact of the matter is, even as we're in the courts, as Jerry and as others are in the courtroom, as the lawyers committee is in the courtroom, because we were down there with Jerry on the Texas issues and ACLU and everybody, we still got to walk and chew gum at the same time, as we say. So even as we're doing all that, we've got to make sure that people get their IDs and know how to protect the vote. So before I get called by Michael Eric Dyson, I want to make sure that you know to go get this pamphlet, to get the toolkit, to get this information, and use the hotline and the EP app to get these resources. Because it's very important that we know how to protect our own right to vote. And I'll leave with this, because I was very happy that Spencer, Professor Overton, connected the dots between what was going on in Ferguson and what it is that we're talking about here today, because they're all connected. But, and so I want to tell you this, that not everybody agrees on issues, obviously. We are all individuals. But something that really resonated with me in another panel was listening to Elaine Jones at the town hall. And if anybody of you ever heard Elaine Jones, former head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, she's a bit animated and very excitable at times, and I love her for that. And one of the comments she made was this. She said, you don't have to like me. You don't have to like me. But as long as I have the right to vote, you will respect me. And that's what this is all about. You use that right to vote to make sure that everybody respects what it is that you bring to the table. And that's what we had to do the people had to do in Ferguson, that's what we have to do in our own communities. That's how we connect all the dots as to the problems that are happening in our society. We've got to exercise that right to vote. Members of Congress will listen, they'll respect you because you've got that power in your hands. And so we're giving you these tools, use it, and make sure everybody out there knows how to respect you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Can you give us the app information again? What was that?
Sure. You can text EP app, APP, to 90975.
90975.
And it's available right now on the iPhone and the Apple Store. Mm-hmm. I have an Android, so I don't really know what it's called, but yeah, that one. And so, but if you have an Android, you can still text EP app, and it should be able to 90975, and you can get that as soon as it's available.
Okay, and regular rates do apply. So we now have Adam, is it Leoz? Leoz, okay. Adam Leoz, counsel for DEMOS. He's a lawyer and public and policy advocate who joined DEMOS in November 2011. He focuses on litigation to enforce the National Voter Registration Act and prison-based gerrymandering and policy advocacy to promote political equality and democratic fairness through safeguarding the right to vote and curbing the influence of big money on the political process. He got his JD from Yale in 2007, his BA from Duke. We'll have to forgive you for that, from the Duke part, as a Michigan person. In 1998, and he recently published Breaking the Vicious Cycle, How the Supreme Court Helped Create the Inequality Era and Why New Jurisprudence Must Lead Us Out. Welcome you to the microphone here.
I'm used to being in hostile territory regarding the Duke part, so that's not, that's most of the country, right? So, let's see, how do I do view? Slide. Oh, what did I just do? Fix that. All right, I'll get started while they fix that. So, my name is Adam Leoz. I'm with DEMOS. We're working for an America where everyone has an equal voice in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. We see those issues as very deeply linked, and I'm here. I'm here today to thank Congressman Conyers for having the vision to allow me to talk about something that I think works hand in glove with voter suppression to perpetuate the issue that Professor Daniels raised, which is that Congress is getting whiter while the country is getting browner. Why is that? Well, part of it has to do with voter suppression, and there's another part of the equation, I think, which is the role of big money in politics. So I'm going to get started. Okay, why don't we just close it and start again? Okay, let's open this again. Hit this? F5. F5. Sorry about this.
All the way at the bottom.
Slideshow, yep. There you go, from this slide, from current slide. There you go, boom. There we go, all right. Okay, so everyone knows that the role of money in elections is growing. There's been a lot of talk about the role of outside spending. Who here has heard of Citizens United? Almost everyone, right? So since Citizens United, lots more big money coming in on the outside. What we don't talk about a lot is that members of Congress are raising a shocking percentage of their money from people who give at least $1,000. Raise your hand if you've given $1,000 to a politician lately. A few people in this room, but not a lot. And that reflects the status across the country. As you can see in this slide, people running for the Senate raised 64% of their money from contributions of at least $1,000 from 4/100ths of 1% of the population. Very small number of people funding our elections. So money has a big role in determining who runs for office in the first place and what those folks believe and their experience as they run. The result, as summed up in this quote, this is a book that came out in 2012, which talks about how the fact that the government is much more responsive to the wealthy donor class, and I owe that expression to Spencer Overton on this panel who published an article called The Donor Class, than it is to the rest of the country. And basically this matters because, as you can see here, folks who are very wealthy don't move through the world in the same way as the rest of us and tend to have very different priorities and positions on key issues. As you can see, this is about whether it's more important, creating jobs in our communities or fighting debt and deficit. The wealthy have opposite views of the general public. And this is true across a range of issues that affect us in our pocketbooks. Core economic kitchen table issues about the role that government should play in making sure we have a fair economy. The thing is, this has a strong racial dynamic, and this is a preview right now of a paper that Demos will be releasing in November on the influence of money in politics on racial justice. And I see Greg Moore in the audience. I want to give him a shout out. This is going to be a partnership with the Democracy Initiative to get this paper out far and wide to show folks that there's a strong connection here. First, the donor class, the folks who are responsible for most of the money, is overwhelmingly white. You can see the top 1% are more than 90% white. Large donors, more than 90% of the $200 plus donors in the 2012 elections came from majority white neighborhoods, much less in African American, Latino neighborhoods. Small donors, on the other hand, are much more diverse. We have evidence from New York City, for example, that as the donation size goes up, the diversity of the donor goes down. So I want to pause on this graph. This is African American donors in New York City. And you can see down towards the small donors below 100, around $10, $20, African Americans actually make up more of the donor pool than they do of the city. So the idea that African Americans aren't participating in politics, as Spencer called out earlier, that's BS. That's not the case. People are contributing, people are active. The thing is, as you go up the scale, because of historical discrimination and wealth gaps, etc., you have less ability to give. And so as the contribution size goes up, the percentage of African Americans represented goes down sharply. What this means is the flip side of the equation. We heard that the government is much more responsive to the wealthy. Well, there's another political scientist who found that for folks at the bottom third of the income scale, government is basically non-responsive. They have no impact on government decisions, and of course, African Americans, Latinos, etc., are overrepresented in that bottom third. So we have voices not being heard in the political process. And of course, For people of color, their policy preferences are much more aligned with the general public than with the wealthy white donor class. So this has a lot of consequences for policies. What are the consequences for the way our election system works? There's 4 key consequences. Candidates, when they are running, don't prioritize communities of color. Those aren't the neighborhoods they're going to raise their $1,000 checks. And so voices, once again, are not heard. Candidates of color have a difficult time running because they have less access to these networks of wealthy donors. So fewer candidates of color are running. When they do, they raise less money than their white counterparts. And ultimately, they win less, leading to what Professor Daniels highlighted, which is underrepresentation in Congress. A new study that's just out found that candidates of color raised 47% less money, controlling for a whole set of factors than their white counterparts. In the South, it's even worse, 64% less money raised by candidates of color. And you can see here, the bottom stat, I think, is telling that measured just by the number of votes cast, African Americans are underrepresented in Congress by about 40%. So there should be a lot more folks in the Congressional Black Caucus than there are, and that's not all because of the role of money, but it has something to do with the role of money. So in our report, we're going to highlight a number of case studies about how this actually has an effect on people's lives every day. There's one about the mortgage crisis, the private prison industry, the minimum wage and how that's stagnated, creating jobs versus deficit. You saw that graph earlier about what the priorities are of the donor class. Is it any wonder that the conversation here in DC has been dominated by fighting the deficit instead of putting our friends and neighbors back to work? That's not a coincidence. Now, there are a couple of key things that we can do to change this. The first is that we mentioned the Supreme Court in a lot here because of the Shelby County decision. The Roberts Court has been up to no good in a lot of areas, including the role of money in politics. So the Citizens United case I mentioned, a more recent case called McCutcheon FEC, basically the court has limited our options from a policy perspective. So what we need to do is reclaim our Constitution. We can do that in one of 2 ways. We can transform the Supreme Court's approach to money in politics, and we are working on a long-term project with actually 2 of my co-panelists here, the Campaign Legal Center and the Brennan Center, and Demos are working on a big project to do that, and we invite everyone here to join into that project. Or also we can amend the Constitution directly. An earlier panelist talked about amending the Constitution for a right to vote. We also need to clarify that the people have the power to pass common sense limits on big money in politics. The other strategy, so that's basically curbing the influence of big donors. The other strategy is lifting up all of our voices, and then what we can do there is match with public funds small contributions so that all of our voices are amplified and the average folks can have a leading say in the process. So basically, what I want to say is that money in politics is a civil rights issue. It is the flip side of political equality, of having your voice heard at the ballot box. And ultimately, our work here won't be done until we address, of course, the efforts to suppress all of our votes, but at the same time, the nefarious role of big money in our political system. Thanks.
Last but certainly not least, the Reverend Dr. Wendell Anthony. Lights are dim. Get the offering plates out.
Thank you.
Mention money, they turn those lights on real fast. All the tithers come forward. Reverend Dr. Wendell Anthony is a native of St. Louis, Missouri. Right there. This is a man who understands that terrain in his gut. He was educated in the Detroit public school system, graduated from Wayne State University with a BA in political science at Merritt Grove College with an MA in pastoral ministry. He became the pastor fellowship chaplain in December of 1986 following the passing of Reverend James E. Wadsworth, and was installed as senior pastor in February of 1987. He's received the honorary doctorate of arts from Merritt Grove College. He is currently serving his 11th term as president of the Detroit branch NAACP, the largest unit in the nation, and I would venture to say the best branch.
That's right.
I'm not sure if everybody would agree, but you should. A powerful and active branch, and it is because of the extraordinary leadership of this singular minister who has reached far beyond the confines of the pulpit to bring the church to bear upon the existential and political and structural crises that haunt this nation So I bring to you now the Reverend Dr. Wendell Anthony, President of Detroit Transportation.
Thank you, Dr. Dyson. Let me say good afternoon, everybody. And as we close out this section relative to the remarks that I made, I certainly want to acknowledge, and I have to because he is my congressman, the Honorable John Conyers. And let me pause there because Dr. Dyson did something earlier that had he not done it, I was going to do it. But because of the historic nature and stature of this man, it's worthwhile to do it again, to the degree that I don't think we really recognize the significance of this gentleman. He is not only the first African American to chair the House Judiciary Committee, and everybody in America and throughout the world has been touched by his work, but he is the first African American to be the Dean of the United States Congress. That's worthy of recognition. Amen. We want to recognize that because it is worthy of recognition. The Bible says, by their fruits you shall know them. He has produced great fruit, and I want to acknowledge it. And I look forward to some sort of ritualistic payment as he gets ready to assume that new position relative to the next session of Congress. And if they don't do it, then we must do it to honor John Conyers for 15 years bringing back the bill to declare the Dr. King national holiday, a national holy day to be remembered. I'm sorry those children are gone, because Sankofa means looking back so that you can go forward. And they need to look back and understand who they were in the room with. As we talk about this, Dr. Dyson, and there's so much good stuff that's already been said and articulated, and I don't want to be redundant, but because of the professional expertise and knowledge of all the peoples, something may be repeated. But our hearts also were fluttering when we heard that Attorney General Eric Holder was resigning or stepping down because he represents voter protection. And Congressman, we pray and hope that whoever succeeds him brings forward to the table the same kind of emphasis and priority that he has given this most paramount issue in our nation. No one should succeed him who does not bring to the table what he has already brought and take it to the next level. And I believe that the people must hear that. And I hope and I believe that the president will bring forward individuals or an individual who will continue the legacy that Holder and he have started. Because the first thing that Eric Holder said when he became Attorney General was, I want to announce to the country that the Department of Civil Rights is now back open for business. Bush closed the door, Eric Holder opened the door. And I just want to acknowledge that in his absence, but physically, but certainly not spiritually. It seems to me to be incongruent that in a nation that prides itself on justice and voting rights and fair play, that we're even having this discussion. Due to the fact that we are in nations around the world fighting right now for people to have the right to vote and for people to be able to exercise their choices. We applauded the Arab Spring that was held in many Arab nations throughout the Middle East. Because those are people who look to what we had done in America to want to exercise their choice and their rights to vote. We have sent delegations to other nations to monitor and to watch and to determine whether or not they exercised the right to vote, and that everybody was in fact voting. But here we find that we are in the midst of the center of democracy for the world, and we are challenged by those same rights and not being able to vote. We deal with voter suppression and oppression on a day-to-day basis. And the fact that so many people who have used this Supreme Court, which is much less than supreme. We used to go to the Supreme Court and get supreme justice. Now we go there and we scared to death about the injustice that we're gonna get from there. They gutted this. They have made corporations the same as people. How ridiculous is that? And we find ourselves in a nation where, even in the state of Texas, you can register to vote by using your gun permit card, but you can't use your college ID. Something is wrong in a nation that prioritizes bullets over ballots. And that's where we find ourselves. In the state of Michigan, the Detroit branch NAACP, along with all the other units, but particularly out of Detroit, I want you to know that in 1998, we came up out of Detroit with the campaign called Take Your Souls to the Polls. Now, I know some of y'all have been hearing it, but that comes from Detroit. That comes from the Detroit branch NAACP. Get your Jet magazine in 1998, and there's an article in there on that comes from Detroit. I want you to know that because I'm the one that came up with that phrase. Take your soul to the polls. And I want you to understand that ain't braggadocious. I'm just saying that for the correctness of history. And we need to be historically correct when it comes to identifying where we're not. So that basically meant, the reason we did that, Congressman and Dr. Dyson, we had souls in two specific adjectives. Soul, S-O-U-L, your heart, and soul, S-O-L-E, your shoes. We were directing it to the hip-hop and young people community. We had posters and banners that had a turned around cap and had big gym shoes on, because that's what our kids were wearing. Take your souls to the polls. For the older people, take your soul, meaning your heart, to the poll. We don't care whether it's your soul or your heart, get one or the other to the polls. And that's what it was about. And so we had a 4-tier campaign: voter registration, voter education, voter mobilization, and voter protection, all enveloped in that campaign. And that's what it's about. As a matter of fact, we are doing that right now. Voter registration, voter education, voter mobilization, and voter protection, which also includes the prisons. It must include the prisons because many folk, you know, a lot of our folk are in prison and they don't think they can vote. They can vote absentee, particularly if, in fact, they have not been sentenced, if they're getting ready to get out, or if they're getting ready to go in. They still have the right to vote. And we need to be able to make sure that our folk understand that. And it varies from state to state, but I'm talking about our state. We have not had the kind of voter suppression methods as some have had in other states. Although we have the nefarious emergency manager law. That is a law in which the governor of the state can hand select an individual who has no experience at running municipalities and put him or her in charge of a local community, to the degree that the mayor has no power, the city council has no power, and to just do what a manager does to manage the governance. Well, in Detroit or in Michigan, 51% of African Americans live under an emergency manager. So while we are not saying you can't vote early or you cannot, you got to use your photo ID, well, if you have a voting, an emergency manager, you're suppressing the vote, because people will say, well, Reverend Anthony, why should I take my souls to the polls? Because when my soul looks back, I can't vote, and my vote really don't count. So it has the measure of having the same effect. And don't look at me like, oh, that's different. Stay tuned. It's coming to your community as well. Because if it works like this in Michigan, it can work like this in New York, It can work like this in Chicago and DC, in South Carolina, North Carolina, wherever you happen to be from, the same show can be taken on the road. And this road is a show that folk are using. We have a Republican governor, and let me just say this. I pray and hope. This is not a partisan thing. Voting is not a partisan thing. Republicans, Democrats, independents, and folk who don't know what they are should be able to access the voting booth. However, it just seems when you look at the record, most of the suppression in this country, if not all of it, happens to be coming with an R attached to it, to the degree that Republicans seem to have a keen interest in suppressing the vote, which has been heightened since a fellow by the name of Barack Hussein Obama has been elected as President of the United States. But let me say this, and people need to understand this. Barack Hussein Obama will never, ever be on a ballot again. His tenure is over in the next 2 years. That means the hell that we're catching is not necessarily from DC, it's from your local municipalities, it's from your governors, it's from your state representatives, it's from your city council, it's from your state senators. They're the ones that are doing the do to suppress your vote. They're the ones that are electing folk that don't have your interest in heart. I'm from St. Louis, as it was said. I was born in the St. Louis County Hospital, raised in Detroit. However, in a little town called Kinloch, I live 10 minutes away from Ferguson. My grandmama used to tell us, don't go to Ferguson, because if you go to Ferguson, there's a sundown room. Sundown, get your butt out of town, but don't be caught after sundown, because if you are, then we might not ever see you again. Now, that's tragic. We didn't do that, but the point is, and it was mentioned earlier and must not be underlooked here, is that in Ferguson, black folk and white folk, but the black folk in the last presidential election came out something like 58 to 60%. That's how they voted. In their own local elections, they came out 6 to 8%. They have the responsibility and could have changed who the mayor was, who the city council was, who the prosecutor was that don't want to represent them. And it's not just Ferguson, it's in local municipalities all around this nation. Folks, it's about turnout. It's about turnout. It's about turnout. When we turn out, we win. When we stay at home, we lose. It's as simple as that. We have to have so many votes out that no matter what kind of shenanigans they pull, that they can't take the vote away from us. At the same time, we gotta have all these lawyers, Dr. Dyson. We gotta have our voter protection. We should have the constitutional structure that makes sure that we vote. And let me say this. What the heaven is sacrosanct about voting on a Tuesday in November once every 2 years or once every 4 years? Why can't we have weekend voting? Why do we have to have one day to vote? Why can't we vote for doing an entire week to make sure that everybody is voting? What's the deal? That's not a Democratic issue. That's not a Republican issue. That's an American issue. And so we should be pushing for an extended time period rather than a contracted time period. And that should come from every community across this nation. From black folk, white folk, brown folk, yellow folk, all kind of folks should be pushing that same thing. And so I know that the time is limited, but I'm simply saying this. It's about turnout. It's about turnout. It's about turnout. When we turn out, we win. When we stay at home, we lose. Take your souls to the polls and vote like your life depends upon it, because quite frankly, it does.
microphone for the next one. But let's give it up for the Reverend Dr. Wendell Anthony one more time. We might have some speaking in tongues up in here right now. And take your souls to the polls and your ass right along with it. Assets. I'm sorry, I didn't assets. I meant assets. That's what I meant. Oh, I told you preachers. Did I not tell you that? But the Reverend Dr. Anthony has brilliantly summarized this, as articulated as he always does, and has made it quite plain for us to understand what's at stake, because our lives really are at stake. All of these panelists have done a great job. Give it up for them once again. Now, we want you to stay in your seats, because the next panel on reparations in H.R. 40 is being impaneled right now. So these two are intimately yoked. A concern for the defense of our voting rights and a recognition that some compensatory justice is critical to the maintenance and preservation of democracy. So we're going to ask this brilliant panel, which you're going to applaud for once again, to make room for the next moderator and the next panel, so that you all can be able to participate in that as well. All right? Thank you.